Ever wonder why today's biggest sci-fi blockbusters feel so familiar, even when they claim to break new ground? The truth is, cinema's most revolutionary ideas rarely begin with the films everyone remembers. Behind every Star Wars or Avatar lies a forgotten pioneer that quietly reshaped what science fiction could be. Films that dared to experiment when no one was watching, only to see their innovations reappear decades later in billion-dollar franchises. The most shocking part? Many of these groundbreaking films bombed at the box office or were dismissed by critics upon release. Some were too ahead of their time, while others were eclipsed by flashier contemporaries that borrowed their best ideas. These are the secret influences that Hollywood executives don't want you to know about. The blueprint originals that laid the groundwork for today's biggest hits. From mind-bending narratives that questioned reality decades before The Matrix to practical effects that inspired generations of filmmakers, these 13 forgotten classics didn't just contribute to science fiction, they fundamentally altered its DNA. And what's even more surprising is how many modern directors secretly reference these films while rarely acknowledging their debt. So what exactly makes a forgotten classic? These aren't just underrated gems, they're films whose innovations were so seamlessly absorbed into the mainstream that their revolutionary impact has been all but erased from popular memory. Each one introduced techniques, themes, or visual styles that would later become industry standards. When early audiences walked out of theaters confused or disappointed by these experimental visions, few could have predicted how these supposed misfires would eventually transform cinema. The question isn't just why these films were forgotten, it's why the industry worked so hard to make you forget them in the first place. In 1927, while Hollywood was still figuring out how to incorporate sound into movies, a German expressionist filmmaker created what would become the template for nearly every dystopian cityscape in cinema history. Fritz Lang's Metropolis wasn't just ahead of its time, it was operating in an entirely different dimension from its contemporaries. The film's massive Art Deco cityscapes, robot technology, and class warfare narrative established visual and thematic elements that would reappear in everything from Blade Runner to The Fifth Element. But what truly set Metropolis apart was its groundbreaking special effects. Using revolutionary techniques like the Shuftan process, involving mirrors to create the illusion of massive sets, Lang created impossible architecture decades before computer-generated imagery. Despite its now obvious influence, Metropolis was a financial disaster that nearly bankrupted Germany's UFA studio. Critics called it naive and simplistic. The film was heavily cut for international release, with nearly a quarter of the original footage lost for decades. It wasn't until 2010 that audiences could finally see something close to Lang's complete vision. By then, filmmakers had been quietly plundering its visual vocabulary for generations. Using cutout animation with surrealist designs, Lelouch created one of the most genuinely alien worlds ever depicted on screen. The film followed humans living as pets on a planet of giant blue beings called drags. Its psychedelic visuals and philosophical themes about oppression made it an underground sensation, but its techniques for depicting truly non-human intelligence and ecosystems would later influence everything from Avatar to Arrival. While major studios were churning out monster movies with men in rubber suits, Fantastic Planet proved that animation could tackle sophisticated sci-fi concepts impossible to realize with practical effects. The film's legacy extends beyond cinema into music videos, album art, and even video games. Anywhere creators need to depict truly alien consciousness. When The Day the Earth Stood Still arrived in theaters in 1951, America was gripped by nuclear paranoia and the Red Scare. Unlike the monster movies that dominated 1950s sci-fi, director Robert Wise created something far more disturbing, a film that suggested humanity itself might be the real threat. The story of alien messenger Klaatu and his indestructible robot Gort wasn't just a warning about nuclear technology, it pioneered the concept of the philosophical alien visitor narrative that would later fuel films from Close Encounters of the Third Kind to Arrival. Its influence extended beyond storytelling to sound design, with composer Bernard Herrmann's use of theremin creating the template for how alien encounters should sound. What's frequently overlooked is how the film circumvented production code censorship to deliver subversive political commentary. By using aliens to criticize humanity's destructive tendencies, Wise smuggled anti-McCarthy sentiment onto American screens at the height of the Red Scare. This technique of using science fiction as political allegory would become one of the genre's most powerful tools. The film's commercial success spawned countless imitators, but few recognized how it had fundamentally shifted sci-fi away from monsters toward messaging. When Klaatu delivered his ultimatum to humanity, he established a narrative device that would reappear in countless films, using an alien perspective to hold a mirror to human society. Marker's film introduced the concept of the time travel loop, where a character discovers they cannot change the past because their attempt to do so actually creates the very timeline they were trying to alter. This mind-bending concept has since become a staple of science fiction, appearing in films like Predestination and Looper. Beyond its narrative innovations, Jetée proved that sci-fi could succeed with mood and concept rather than spectacle, influencing a generation of philosophical science fiction. Despite rarely appearing on mainstream best-of lists, Jetée is arguably one of the most influential science fiction films ever made, with directors from James Cameron to Rian Johnson acknowledging its impact on their work. Its haunting final sequence on an airport jetty has been referenced and recreated dozens of times by filmmakers who understand its significance, even as general audiences remain unaware of the original. While Star Wars was revolutionizing blockbuster filmmaking with its space fantasy approach, a different strain of science fiction was quietly predicting our environmental future. Douglas Trumbull's Silent Running, 1972, told the story of a botanist tending the last forests of Earth, preserved in space greenhouse domes. Though overshadowed by more commercial contemporaries, this ecological fable introduced concepts that would become sci-fi staples. The film's three maintenance robots, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, predated Star Wars R2-D2, but established many of the traits that would make non-humanoid robots beloved characters. More importantly, Silent Running pioneered environmental sci-fi decades before climate anxiety became mainstream. Its vision of a future Earth devoid of natural life has proven disturbingly prophetic, with films like WALL-E and Interstellar exploring similar territory decades later. What made Silent Running truly revolutionary was its practical effects. Trumbull, who had worked on 2001: A Space Odyssey, created believable space sequences on a fraction of that film's budget. His innovations in miniature photography would influence effects work for decades, with many of his techniques still used in the digital era. The film also established the space greenhouse as a visual metaphor for humanity's relationship with nature, a motif that continues to appear in science fiction. Dark Star subverted space opera conventions by showing the mundane reality of space travel, astronauts growing bored, playing pranks, and arguing with their equipment. Its lived-in future aesthetic, where technology malfunctions and corridors are cluttered with junk, would later influence the production design of Alien and countless other sci-fi films that rejected the sterile futures of earlier decades. Beyond its visual influence, Dark Star pioneered the concept of artificial intelligence as a philosophical entity. The scene where a crew member must debate phenomenology with an explosive device to prevent it from detonating established AI as a character type rather than merely a plot device. From HAL 9000 to modern AI films like Ex Machina, the concept of reasoning with artificial consciousness can trace its lineage back to this low-budget debut. The mid-1970s saw a brief flowering of truly experimental sci-fi that pushed the boundaries of the genre. None was more visually distinctive than Saul Bass's only feature film, Phase 4, 1974. Best known as the designer of iconic movie title sequences, Bass created a film about superintelligent ants that featured the most extraordinary insect photography ever committed to film. Working with wildlife photographer Ken Middleham, Bass captured ant behavior with such intimate detail that it created a genuinely alien perspective. The film's stunning macro photography techniques would later influence nature documentaries and science fiction alike, with films from Them to Ant-Man owing a debt to Bass's pioneering work. What truly distinguished Phase 4 was its rejection of conventional narrative. The film unfolds with the logic of a nightmare, focusing on mood and symbolism rather than plot. This approach to sci-fi as psychological experience rather than traditional storytelling would later influence films like Under the Skin and Annihilation. The film's final psychedelic sequence, cut by the studio but later restored, represents one of cinema's most ambitious attempts to depict non-human consciousness. Though a commercial failure upon release, Phase 4 has developed a cult following among filmmakers and visual artists. Its vibrant color palette and geometric compositions have been referenced in everything from music videos to video game design. More importantly, it demonstrated that science fiction could function as visual art rather than mere storytelling. Stalker established the concept of the weird zone, a location where reality operates by different rules that would later appear in films like Annihilation and Color Out of Space. Its concept of the zone directly inspired the video game series Stalker and influenced the representation of contaminated landscapes in post-apocalyptic fiction. What made Stalker truly revolutionary was Tarkovsky's approach to pacing. His long, uninterrupted takes and philosophical dialogue scenes proved that sci-fi could operate at a different tempo than action-oriented Hollywood productions. This contemplative approach would later influence directors from Denis Villeneuve to Christopher Nolan, who recognized that slowness could create tension more effectively than rapid cutting. Years before The Matrix blew audiences' minds with its simulation hypothesis, a German television miniseries was exploring the same territory. Rainer Werner Fassbinder's World on a Wire, 1973, adapted Daniel F. Galoui's novel Simulacron 3 into a stylish thriller about a computer-generated world whose inhabitants believe they are real. Despite predating The Matrix by 26 years, World on a Wire established many of the visual and philosophical elements that would make the Wachowskis' film a phenomenon. Its distinctive use of mirrors, reflections, and surveillance imagery to suggest reality's fragility created a visual language for depicting simulation that later films would adopt. Its protagonist's journey from simulation administrator to revolutionary bears striking similarities to Neo's arc. What made World on a Wire truly ahead of its time was its understanding of the philosophical implications of simulated consciousness. Long before digital effects could visualize such concepts, Fassbinder used analog techniques like unusual camera movements and disorienting set design to suggest a world that didn't quite follow physical laws. These techniques would later influence films from Existenzies to Inception. Despite its obvious influence on later sci-fi, World on a Wire remained virtually unknown to international audiences until its 2010 restoration. By then, the concepts it pioneered had become so commonplace that viewers might not recognize how revolutionary they once were. This pattern of rediscovery decades after release is common to many of cinema's most influential sci-fi works. Rogue's use of intercutting between time periods and realities created a disorienting experience that mirrored the alien protagonist's confusion. This technique for representing alternate consciousness would later appear in films from Arrival to 2001, A Space Odyssey. More subtly, the film's portrayal of an alien struggling to maintain his identity while being affected by Earth's pleasures established the fallen visitor narrative that would reappear in films like Under the Skin. Beyond its narrative innovations, The Man Who Fell to Earth revolutionized science fiction aesthetics through its extraordinary production design and cinematography. Its saturated colors and symbolic imagery rejected the sterile futurism popular in 1970s sci-fi in favor of a more expressionistic approach. This visual style would later influence music videos, fashion photography, and filmmakers from Michel Gondry to Jonathan Glazer. Perhaps the most influential modern example of a forgotten sci-fi classic is Shane Carruth's Primer, 2004. Made for just $7,000, this ultra-low-budget time travel film proved that compelling science fiction didn't require special effects or studio backing, just rigorous ideas and creative problem-solving. Primer rejected simplified explanations and audience hand-holding, instead presenting a realistic depiction of how engineers might actually discover time travel. Its deliberately complex narrative, which some viewers still debate years later, established a new approach to time travel storytelling that prioritized logical consistency over easy comprehension. This approach would influence everything from Looper to Tenet. What made Primer truly revolutionary was its production model. By serving as writer, director, producer, composer, and star, Carruth demonstrated that a single determined filmmaker could create sophisticated science fiction outside the studio system. This model would inspire countless independent sci-fi filmmakers in the digital era, with films like Coherence and The Endless, following its example of idea-driven narratives on minimal budgets. Despite winning the Grand Jury Prize at Sundance, Primer remained largely unseen by mainstream audiences. Its reputation has grown through word of mouth among filmmakers and sci-fi enthusiasts, becoming a secret influence acknowledged by directors like Rian Johnson and Christopher Nolan, while remaining unknown to general viewers who enjoy the films it inspired. Gattaca rejected the common science fiction trope of using spectacular imagery to create future worlds. Instead, it employed retrofuturism, using vintage architecture and classic design elements to suggest an alternate timeline rather than a distant future. This approach to world building through design rather than special effects would influence films from Her to Never Let Me Go. More importantly, Gattaca pioneered the soft dystopia, a future that appears clean, functional, and advanced, while concealing systemic oppression. This concept would become increasingly common in science fiction as filmmakers recognized that the most convincing dystopias aren't post-catastrophic wastelands, but orderly societies built on hidden injustice. Films from Minority Report to The Hunger Games would adopt this approach. Despite critical acclaim, Gattaca was a box office disappointment that only found its audience years later. Its reputation has grown steadily as its predictions about genetic discrimination and surveillance have proven increasingly prescient. Today, it's studied in bioethics classes and recognized as one of the most thoughtful sci-fi films ever made, a far cry from its initial reception. 1 year before The Matrix revolutionized science fiction, Alex Proyas' Dark City, 1998, explored remarkably similar territory. This noir-influenced thriller about a man who discovers his reality is an alien experiment featured many elements that would later make The Matrix famous. Reality manipulation, artificial environments, and a messianic protagonist who gains the power to reshape his world. Dark City pioneered the aesthetic that would define turn-of-the-millennium science fiction, a blend of noir elements, practical sets, and early digital effects that created a cohesive and believable alternate reality. Its constantly shifting cityscape, which physically restructured itself when inhabitants were asleep, created some of the most memorable visual sequences in 1990s cinema. Beyond its visual innovations, Dark City explored philosophical questions about memory and identity that would become increasingly central to science fiction. The film's premise, that memories alone constitute identity, anticipated later works like Blade Runner 2049 and Westworld that would explore the same territory. Its aliens, who studied human emotion by implanting different memories in their subjects, established a narrative device that would reappear in films from The Adjustment Bureau to Inception. Despite these innovations, Dark City underperformed at the box office, overshadowed by bigger budget releases. When The Matrix arrived a year later with a larger marketing budget and more spectacular action sequences, many of Dark City's innovations were attributed to the Wachowskis instead. Only gradually has Proyas' film reclaimed its reputation as one of the most influential sci-fi works of its era. What these 13 forgotten classics reveal is a hidden history of science fiction cinema, one where the most innovative ideas often emerge from overlooked films rather than acknowledged classics. From Metropolis to Primer, these works transformed the genre not through commercial success, but through their influence on other filmmakers. Many were commercial failures upon release, only to be rediscovered years or decades later when audiences had caught up to their innovations. Others received critical acclaim but were quickly forgotten as flashier imitators adopted their best ideas. Some suffered from poor marketing or release timing that prevented them from finding their audience until they appeared on home video or streaming services. The pattern is clear. True innovation rarely receives immediate recognition. Instead, it's absorbed into the mainstream through a process of influence and imitation that often erases the original source. Today's biggest sci-fi blockbusters owe their existence to these forgotten pioneers, films that dared to experiment when experimentation was commercially risky. What's perhaps most remarkable is how many of these innovations came from filmmakers working outside the studio system or with minimal budgets. From Chris Marker's photo montage to Shane Carruth's $7,000 Marvel, some of cinema's most influential science fiction emerged from necessity rather than excess. These filmmakers proved that compelling science fiction depends more on ideas than spectacle, a lesson that today's CGI-driven blockbusters could benefit from remembering. As we watch the latest science fiction releases, it's worth asking what forgotten classics might be among them. Which overlooked films of today might be recognized as revolutionary decades from now? Cinema's most influential works aren't always the ones that receive immediate acclaim. Sometimes they're the quiet revolutionaries that change everything while no one is watching.